Hello and welcome to a game design lecture on game balancing. My name is Jarek Frankik and the lecture is based on this book, Fundamentals of Game Design by Ernest Adams and Andrew Rawlings. The objectives of this session, after we define what we understand as a balanced game, are as follows. We will discuss how to avoid dominant strategies, how to use chance, design a fair game, manage difficulty, which is a very important aspect of balancing games, and at the final part of this lecture we will also talk about controlling positive feedback and designing games that are easy to tune. So, what is a balanced game? A balanced game is first of all a game that is fair to the player or to the players. It's also never too easy or not too hard, it's just right, so it follows the Goldilocks principle. And a balanced game makes the skill of the player the main decisive point about success or failure in the game, in determining the success. Concept of balance and also the concept of the fairness in games differs between what we call PvP and PvE games. These acronyms stand for respectively player versus player and player versus environment, or player versus computer games. Whatever the type of a game is, a well-balanced game will be first of all providing meaningful choices, and absolutely important here is to avoid a dominant strategy. A dominant strategy is the one that you can choose, and choosing the strategy would guarantee success or at least put you in a very beneficial position. Moreover, each strategy in a game should give a reasonable chance of eventually producing a victory. Also, players' skills must affect success, so the player has to feel that the more skilled he or she is, the better chance to win the game. This means that the games can be managed by chance, by a random factor, but the role of this random factor must be somewhat reduced, otherwise the player's skills would become irrelevant for the game success. Now, additional balance requirements for the PvP or player versus player games. Players must perceive the game to be fair. And it is very important that we say perceive. That is the perception of the player which is really important here, not the actual mathematical chances. Okay, we can have a mathematically fair game, but if it is not perceived by the players as fair, it won't succeed. This is a good news for game designers, or a bad news. Bad news because you could calculate using mathematical approach, strict mathematical approach, the chances of both players, and if this is fair, you could consider the game as fair as possible. On the other hand, sometimes games are very difficult to balance in mathematical terms, and in this case the fact that this is the perception of the players that we care about may be very helpful. Okay. Also, a player who falls behind should have an opportunity to catch up. This can be obtained with some kind of rubber banding or negative feedback, giving additional tools, additional benefit for the weaker player, or alternatively providing extra difficulty for the leading player. Balanced PvP games shouldn't lead to a stalemate, or at least do it very rarely in exceptional cases. Additional balance requirements for the PvE, the player versus environment games, are different, even though the first of them, the player perceives the game to be fair, seems to be similar, but the definition of fairness for a PvE game is different. We will discuss it later, but fairness is very much connected, linked to the difficulty, which has to be consistently kept throughout PvE game. Moving on to avoiding dominant strategies, an essential ingredient of keeping both PvP and PvE games balanced. A dominant strategy is a strategy that reliably produces the best outcome a player may achieve, no matter what the opponent or the computer, the environment do. They are not desired because once the player discovers the dominant strategy, she will have no more reason to use any other strategy. In Command and Conquer Red Alert game, an experienced player playing at the Soviet side could devote all her energy to produce a large force of tanks in an early part of the game, and then use those tanks to attack the enemy base en masse. Against an unprepared opponent, this almost always produced a victory, and even an experienced opponent could prepare for the onslaught, but the tank rush, as it was called, remained so effective that it took the fun out of the game. Many players added an informal additional rule to the game: no tank rushes allowed, just to balance the problem. Generally, in RTS real-time strategy games, we have these two common strategies: startling, or building up defenses and production capacity while holding off enemy attacks, so it's a low reward maybe, but also low risk strategy; and rushing, attack early to overwhelm the opposition before they have a chance to, a high risk but high reward strategy. If these two strategies are well balanced, so the chances of victory, of success, are reasonably similar in both strategies, the game remains funny because you have a meaningful choice. You can take a decision, and this decision will provide you either one or the other style of the game. But if things become unbalanced, the fun is really over. In terms of entities or resources in the games, if there is something that we call a transitive relationship. A transitive relationship is like in maths. If A is better than B and B is better than C, then A is better than C. If this is such a simple relationship, then there could be never any reason to choose either B or C if A is already the best strategy. So this the transitive relationship between entities leads to inherent imbalance. Okay, to correct this imbalance, you can assign costs to each choice, perhaps a clear choice, clearly communicated, like coming from the game's internal economy, or perhaps say shadow costs. Okay, shadow costs, I mean costs that are not immediately visible. Transitive relationships are quite often used, and in this case they won't lead to an unbalanced or dominant strategy. It's okay if they are used to create upgrades for the player. So you can start with C, and after a time, when you learn, when you get new skills, when you buy, when you get a better position in terms of internal games economy, you can upgrade to B and eventually A. But if the entities can be freely selected, freely chosen, then one possible strategy you can use are so-called intransitive relationships. These are relationships like in rock, paper, scissors. Rock beats the scissors. Scissors beat the paper, but paper beats the rock. There is no clear victory path here, no clear winner in this type of a game. This RPS, rock, paper, scissors model is simple, but it can be adjusted by modifying core mechanics of the game. Another, maybe not very much another, but a kind of a different approach is what we call orthogonal unit differentiation. This is when each kind of unit, each kind of resource is unlike any other, so it goes into a different dimension, like in coordinate system. These resources would be on the x-axis, y-axis and z-axis. If you get a gain on the x direction, it doesn't mean a gain in the y or z direction. For example, you can have combat skills, but you can have wisdom or, say, magical skills in a game. This will guarantee each kind of unit a unique and different function. In player versus environment games, it is very important to avoid exploits. Okay, so the more actions, the more diversity you provide in the game, the more likely that you will create some opportunities to exploit the game. So you should test thoroughly to eliminate these exploits. Sometimes dominant strategies are created by glitches. For example, the Pharaoh's Curse game I played a lot, like 30 or 40 years ago, in the 80s of last century. It was a beautiful game played on 8-bit computers like Atari. It was a really wonderful game, but one day I discovered that you could jump into a wall, just like in Harry Potter, but it was like 20 years before the first Harry Potter. So you could jump into the wall. There was a missing collision block, and jumping into that particular wall meant that you, for momentarily, you would fly across another level screen, just like a fraction of a second. But when I tried the same jump many times over and over and over again, I discovered that jumping at a very specific angle, and you could catch something, land on a platform in a different level, and this was actually a shortcut. A shortcut, like you could have been bypassing, I don't remember exactly, but like a 10 or a dozen levels, including some very hard levels. So once I discovered this exploit, this glitch in the game, I would never more visit like 10 or 12 another levels of the game if I had this particular shortcut. Another old game allowed the player to win by upgrading a weapon and then just running as slow as on the screen as possible, keeping the finger on the fire button at all times, and this was a unintended dominant strategy in this game. Another game made it possible to jump in using a rocket, one of the features of this in this game, in a totally unintended way, and this rocket would just emphasize extend standard jump and allow players to do things otherwise completely impossible. Eliminating the dominant strategy is essential for ensuring that the player's decisions are meaningful. So, in a way, in putting the player at the control of her own fate, the success or failure. But there is also another very important factor, and this is the chance. If you want to keep the player at the control and make her decisions really meaningful, the role of the chance has to be limited. The chance has to be used sparingly. Use chance in frequent challenges with small risks and small rewards. Think about the poker game. Poker game is nearly entirely based on chance, on random results of the cards you draw. But because it's a long sequence of small, minor, random events, you still keep control of what is going on, because along this long frequence of small events, there's enough space for the player to create her own strategy. Okay, so first of all, even if a lot of the game depends on the chance, allow the players to choose actions. And the best thing is to allow the player to choose how much to risk. Okay, and with this we are arriving to the next fundamental topic in this area, and this is how to make games fair. But the fairness will be quite a different notion depending on whether we are talking about player versus player PvP games or PvE, player versus environment. In PvP games, these games first of all can be symmetric games like chess. Chess is not 100% symmetric, because the whites, thanks to the fact that they have the first initial move, are quite often considered to be in a slightly beneficial position. Okay, but in basically in symmetric games, if you just provide both players with the same, or all players, because symmetric doesn't mean that it has to be a two-player game. So if all the players are treated the same, so get the same rules, the same resources, the same victory conditions, this game should be perceived fair. It gets more complicated with asymmetric games like this one. Basically, if you provide players with identical or equivalent quantities of materials or points, and then players spend points on building units as they wish, and these units can be different among players. For example, in StarCraft, you have Terrans, construction units that can repair other units. Then damaged Zerg units heal themselves but at fixed rate, and Protoss units possess both health and shields, but they usually cost twice as much. So they are all somehow balanced, okay, and there is a equality in diversity. Big words, but this is how you have to provide balance in this type of games. Now, thinking about persistent worlds and massively multiplayer games, these worlds are never symmetric, first of all, and they will just unbalance. It's impossible to get them in a full balance. First of all, new players need protection because they lack on experience. All right, so yeah, that's the case. Also, changes. All right, games like this are updated on a regular basis, and some of those updates can ruin the existing balance of the game, but on the other hand, these games can be reasonably well rebalanced on the fly by patching. In case of the PvE, player versus environment games, the fairness is based on quite a different principle, because there's no question of providing the environment with the same resources as the player. There is a question of difficulty here. So a game that is fair has to be, first of all, the game that is at a consistent level of difficulty, not too easy, but also not too hard, so just right. This is what we sometimes call the Goldilocks principle. But there are also some other aspects around this difficulty. So first of all, some stuff that you should really avoid. Avoid learning by dying designs. Avoid stalemates or deadlocks. Also, all the critical information about critical decisions, for example, the decisions that once taken might lead to the loss of life in the game, of course, shouldn't come as a surprise. Basically, any kind of a really nasty surprise is something that just spoils the fun. So something absolutely to be avoided. So you should provide information for critical decisions, avoid requiring extrinsic information, so everything that you need to know about the game, its environment, in order to succeed with the game, should be provided within the game, of course, except of quite obvious cases like quiz games, for example, but it's a different kind of a story. And also, speaking about difficulties, challenges have to be appropriate for the particular game genre. If they are just different, don't fit to the game, they will come as also as a kind of a surprise. And actually, if they are not challenges coming from the game genre, so they can come as a surprise, not expected, but also you have to remember that your players are likely to be good in playing the game you play, because this may be their favorite genre, okay? But if you start to mix up with completely different types of the game, it may happen that their skills are just not comparable to this kind of challenges. And all these things, all these surprises will be considered as something unfair for the players. So basically, the fairness of PvE games is very closely connected to the difficulty. So our next topic will be about how to manage the difficulty in the games. And I have an interesting diagram for you, which is called now it's too difficult. Just a moment, please. Yep.
Mihai, Csikszentmihalyi. Now a little bit faster this time. Mihai, Csikszentmihalyi.
Great. So this is Csikszentmihalyi's flow, which shows that this just right level of difficulty we considered before as a Goldilocks principle is in fact something much more dynamic, maybe not very complicated, but dynamic. Actually, Csikszentmihalyi was not a gaming specialist. His contribution was not within game design. His pioneering work supported our understanding of human happiness and fulfillment. Okay, and here we have exactly this so-called Csikszentmihalyi's flow. Is a state of specific balance between boredom and anxiety, and it is based on catching a very specific balance between player ability and the game difficulty. And you have to notice that whilst a player is playing the game, her ability will increase, and therefore the difficulty of the game has also to increase. Okay? So, basically, balancing a game includes managing the difficulty of its challenges to keep the player within the flow state. And we have always some factors that are outside of the designer's control, like previous experience facing challenges similar to those in your game. Some of these experiences come from previously played games, but some of them can also come from experience outside of the gaming world, from the job profession of the gamer, and so on, and also native talents such as natural hand-eye coordination, reasoning and cognitive skills. In game design, theory of game design, we consider several types of difficulty, and rather than this slide with definitions, I will show you this difficulty on the diagram of changing difficulty along the time of the gameplay. So the first type of difficulty is the absolute difficulty. Absolute difficulty is how really the gameplay is, how difficult the gameplay is. Then we have the relative difficulty, that's the absolute difficulty minus all the power provided to the player by the game. For example, weapon systems that will be consistently better and better throughout the game. Skills based on in-game economy of the game. So based on health, stamina, things like this. Okay, and this relative difficulty. If the absolute difficulty on this diagram, absolute difficulty has quite a steep gradient of increasing, okay, so it rises quite quickly. A relative difficulty will rise slower. And then we have also the perceived difficulty, and the perceived difficulty is what is the final player perception based also on his or her in-game experience. So playing the game, the player not only gets better and better weapons, better and better equipment in-game, but also she learns how to play the game and is more and more skillful, more and more skillful. Okay, so in order to keep the perceived difficulty more or less flat, let's say slowly increasing, you have to keep the relative difficulty increasing much more than that. And absolute difficulty has to increase quite steeply to avoid a scenario like this. This is an example of a game which provides a quickly rising absolute difficulty. Now the power provided to meet the challenges makes the relative difficulty also rising, but then when you consider in-game experience of the player, the perceived difficulty goes down, okay, and there is no fun because the more you play, the easier the game is to play. I'm sure you had experiences like this, and I'm sure you didn't play the game for too long time. So that's what we really have to look at in managing the game's difficulty. creating a difficulty progression, you have to remember that perceived difficulty of challenges shouldn't rise too steeply, should stay the same or rise, but not too fast. Okay, games cannot be too difficult because you will leave the zone of chick send me high flow into the zone of anxiety. Okay, and in games for casual players, most mobile games and also games for children, say young children, okay, because older children mostly play adult games. This difficulty, this curve should be almost completely flat, okay. But remember that a flat perceived difficulty still means the absolute and relative difficulty going up throughout the gameplay. Relative difficulty must increase over time to counteract the player's growing in-game experience, and this is probably the most difficult aspect of managing difficulty. One more aspect, very important aspect of managing difficulty in games are the difficulty modes. Okay, in single-player games, the player should be allowed to choose a difficulty mode, and once she makes a selection, the challenges must stay within that range. You cannot surprise the player with extra difficult challenges because it will be considered unfair. Okay, just imagine the thinking of the player. Okay, I asked for an easy mode, and what I have here is everything but not easy. Okay, if it is absolutely impossible to adjust the difficulty of a challenge, you can always provide a way around for the easy mode and block this go around route for the hard mode. And also I have one more diagram for you. This is so-called difficulty chainsaw model. This is how the perceived difficulty can rise. This is all about a challenging game. Okay, in challenging game you expect that it will get more and more difficult from level to level. But what is the chainsaw model? Look at the level 1. Within the level, the difficulty slowly rises up to the final moment in this level, which is probably a kind of a mini boss fight. And then you should have a moment of relaxation. When you start the new level, you cannot keep the same tension. You cannot just increase the tension of the difficulty all the time. So this is this abrupt, quick decreasing in the level of difficulty. You start level 2, again relaxed, nicely going towards the climax at the end of the level, which the difficulty at this moment will be slightly, but just slightly higher than in level 1. Basically, this is a kind of a geometrical progression. Okay, so the level 3 will start with a substantially higher difficulty and will finish really difficult. Level 4, look, level 4 is nearly at the same level of difficulty as the climax of level 1, and it rises very high. Then you just have a small bit of relax. This is the final level 5, very challenging, finishing with perhaps a final boss fight at a very high level of perceived difficulty. This is the chainsaw model, ideal for challenging, difficult games. So, to somehow summarize the managing difficulty topic, you need to design a game in such a way that it is not too easy, not too hard, but just right. And this means keeping the difficulty level within the chick send me highs flow, thus in a very fragile state of difficulty progression. One method to precisely tune the game's difficulty is through adaptive difficulty. This may be based on a simple method of negative feedback and rubber banding, just as we discussed in the previous lecture on game mechanics, but it also can be a little bit more sophisticated, such as in automatic adjustment of difficulty, an approach which is quite often supported by AI. For example, Max Payne first-person shooter adjusts both the enemy strength and the player's aiming assistance. Some games will offer extra help for struggling players. For example, Crash Bandicoot offers the extra shields if the player fails too many times. And the Crimson Skies, a combat flight simulator, gives an option to skip a mission after you fail this mission for 3 times. Sometimes this mechanics of adaptive difficulty can be exploited. For example, in a racing game Burnout 2, by driving intentionally badly in the beginning of the race, the player could lead the system into confusion, so it automatically reduces the performance of the AI drivers until the end of this race, with a clear benefit for the player. To avoid such exploits, you should use or consider using adaptive difficulty more to make games harder rather than easier. All these methods are based on some kind of negative feedback in order to stabilize the gameplay. But sometimes this may lead to a stalemate, so we may need a small nudge to destabilize the game, and this nudge can be obtained through positive feedback. Positive feedback occurs when a player's achievement changes the game state, making future achievements easier. Like in this diagram here, an achievement earns a reward. Reward can be traded for more power, and more power is the next achievement. So the longer you play, the more achievements, rewards and power you get. Positive feedback can help a lot because it can discourage a stalemate, reward success, but if it is used too much, it can also lead to arms race, a total destabilization of the gameplay, and it can actually be quite destructive. So you will need to control the positive feedback by not giving too much power as a reward, by of course introducing, if we have positive feedback, then we should introduce some negative feedback, some rubber band, not to allow the positive feedback to go too far. But also by raising the absolute difficulty of challenges as the player proceeds. So this is a kind of negative feedback as well, but it's based on the progressing of the player across the game, across the levels. And you can also use the chance to reduce the size of the rewards. Apart from stalemate, there are other problems that you can encounter in your game design, for which it will be rather difficult to solve by either negative or positive feedback, and these are stagnation and triviality. To avoid stagnation, stagnation occurs when the player simply doesn't know what to do next. There are some research results that show that this may be even a major reason for players to drop from the game. So you can hide clues in plain sight about how to proceed. So when the player spends some time to explore the environment, she is likely to find these clues. The game can also detect when the player is wandering aimlessly and provide nudges in the right direction. One of the horror games I recently played had a situation in which was really tricky, but the game was located in an old mansion, and if you visited the same room for the third time, you would notice letters written in blood on the wall, and these letters would provide an important hint about what to do next. About avoiding trivialities, it's just let the computer handle uninteresting details of game. Don't expect that the player would have fun for repetitive and trivial actions. One of the design rules that are quite often very true is walking is not gameplay. Alright, so don't expect players to walk for a long distance without anything different and anything other interesting happening at this time. And in this way, we have completed the review of main aspects of balancing games. We have one more very important topic to discuss. This is how to design the game in that way that it could be easily tuned. The reason for that is that even with the best game design, you will never get a game that will be balanced from the first test play. It's the balancing game is a iterative process, quite complex and usually quite time-consuming. You will, of course, do your best effort to create a design that is well balanced from the very beginning. You can use simulative models like machinations to find out whether the game is already well balanced or not, even before you start writing your code. But the real test will come with the first prototype you have, and only by test playing the game you will eventually discover whether the game is well balanced or not. And in this moment it is absolutely crucial that the game structure, the way in which the game is developed, allows for easy tuning the game so that it doesn't have to be redeveloped each time you discover that something is not so well balanced. So here are some hints about it. This topic is actually on the borderline between game design and game development, game programming, but it's still close enough to game design to be discussed here and in this lecture. So first of all, the mechanics should be generalized wherever possible. Try to avoid creating any special cases as much as possible and whenever possible. Every special case in mechanics, in the game mechanics, if it doesn't support the balanced gameplay, it is likely to need a total redevelopment in order to make it, to improve it and make it better. Separate code and data system, and this is true about any computer-based system, not just a computer game. If system performance, system working is controlled by the data structures, it is easier to overall control. You don't have to change anything in the code. It means that you just need to change some parameters that control the gameplay. And some suggestions for efficient fine-tuning: modify always just one parameter at a time. This is a universal rule for any kind of development work, also very important for coders. When something is not working properly and you modify two or more parameters, and then you discover that it helped a bit but not entirely, you will never know which of those modifications really helped and which of them didn't, if you made several different changes at the same time. So change one thing at a time and everything will be clear. When modifying parameters, always start from big adjustment, big changes, okay, so that it is easy to see whether or not you are on the right track. And then when you more or less know what's the right value of the parameter, you can tune it further and more precisely. Keep records, okay, make a lot of notes. If you discover that something wasn't working well for the game, make a note about it, because in further development you may need to go back to the same thing, to the same aspect of the game, and quite often you will have to go back and undo some changes, some tuning that you had done previously. And also, simple advice, use pseudo-random numbers. What I mean as pseudo-random numbers, of course, every random number used in computing is a pseudo-random, because there is no real randomness in digital systems. But pseudo-random numbers are not really a random sequence of numbers. They are only highly chaotic and very difficult to predict. But there is something that is called a random number seed. This is a kind of initialization of the random number generator, which still creates the chaotic, difficult, hard to predict sequence of seemingly random numbers, but this is repeatable. Okay, it cannot be predicted but can be repeated in the same way, and this is the way in which you can test a game based on chance, okay, based on random values. But if something happened in the game, you have a chance to go back and play the same game again with the same pseudo-random numbers, of the same sequence of pseudo-random numbers. And this concludes our game design lecture on game balancing. We have discussed, first of all, what is a balanced game, and then we saw how to avoid dominant strategies, how to use a chance in the game, how to design a game that is fair, at least fair in the player's perception, with two flavors of this fairness, PvP, or player versus player games, and PvE, player versus environment games. We also learned how to manage difficulty, and then how to control positive feedback to avoid stalemates in the game. We also looked into how to avoid stagnation and trivialities, and in the final short topic we also looked into how to design games that are easy to tune. Thank you very much for watching, and I invite you to more lectures in this series. Goodbye.